Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we're not talking about war, not philosophy, not thunder-wielding gods. Tonight, we're talking about a boy and the price of being called beautiful. You were born in a poor village, dead crops, skinny goats, and the gaze of grown-ups. Silent as a winter that won't end. No one sold you. Only society taught you this. If your face makes people lose their breath, you're no longer a person. You're a decoration that knows how to smile. Then came Lysander. Not a god, just a man who knew how to kill childhood with a compliment. Wealthy, refined, cold, like a hand that knows how to soothe, but also how to strangle. You weren't adopted, you were acquired, not into a family, but into a room sealed with perfume and philosophy. And when night falls, they call it a symposium, where philosophers debate virtue while their hands rest on your thigh, and the wine always smells like something between grapes and teenage sweat. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from across the world. Right now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a gentle humming sound, and let's take this journey together tonight. You don't wake up because of an alarm clock. You wake up because of the iron hinge grinding against marble. The cellar door opens, and the first light of the day isn't a gentle sunrise, but a sharp streak, like a blade slicing through the darkness of a windowless room. You're curled in the corner, the only spot without rats, but with the stench of urine and damp mold. The straw mat beneath you has worn so thin you can feel the cold stone cracks pressing into your spine. Dust, stale sweat, rancid olive oil. Nothing in the air suggests Greek civilization as described in textbooks. A sliver of light glides across the floor, casting itself on the white stone wall, where faded carvings remain. A sphinx, a wine goblet, and a man kneeling. High above is a vaulted ceiling with stone inlay, depicting Apollo pulling the sun with his blazing chariot. But where you lie is the shadow of the horse's leg. You once thought this place might be a temple. Now you know. It's where forgotten relics are stored. Sometimes you imagine that the light slipping through the high crack isn't sunlight, but the gaze of some silent god, watching without ever intervening. Everything once sacred now frames the most profane. The next sound is footsteps in sandals. Heavy, hard, each step echoing evenly on stone, like a countdown clock that doesn't tick tick-tock, but says, "Run now." Your hands tremble as you reach for the crumpled cloth, once a long tunic. Now, it resembles an apology made of fabric. You don't remember your age anymore, maybe 15, maybe 16. Since the day you were taken, birthdays stopped being a concept. Sometimes, you wonder what your name was. Then you realize you're asking the question in Greek, not your native tongue. A part of you has been translated into the language of the key holder. You used to know how to play a reed flute. You had a dog named Melos, who chased chickens and barked at water barrels. All of it now just phantoms in memory, wearing thinner each night. But you don't let yourself forget. Not completely. Each morning, you whisper your mother's name, like a silent prayer, to keep something untouchable from being erased. The light hits your eyes, and you squint. And then, a shadow fills the doorway. The overseer enters like a walking statue, a mass of muscle and scar wrapped around a smile that never arrives. His face looks like a map of beatings, training, and things you never want to ask about. One of his ears is torn. Rumor says it was bitten off by a boy who once fought back. No one asks if that boy is still alive. His name is Demetrius. Once a slave, now a basement manager. Demetrius isn't cruel. He isn't kind, just efficient. "Wash up," he growls, throwing a damp cloth at your feet. "There's a guest tonight." Guest. That word drops into your ears like a stone into a well. No sound, only tremor. You know what guest means. You've known since that first night, when you were dragged from the village, when your mother's scream was swallowed by the wind, when your father couldn't raise his head because the debt's been paid. The overseer looks at you the way people look at horses. No emotion, no disgust, just appraisal. "You're going to help them relax," he says flatly. No order, no request, just a statement, like the sun will rise, and you will hurt. And that's how a day begins in Athens, the capital of philosophy, where people talk about virtue while harming each other behind silk curtains, where light doesn't reveal the truth, only sharpens the whiteness of marble and the darkness of the shadows cast upon it. You once thought you were born from a mother. Turns out to society, you were born from debt. The story begins in a winter of biting poverty, when people burned dried dung for fuel and kept hope alive with silence. Your father used to be a gatekeeper at the small temple on the hill, and your mother spun wool for the women in the village. Both believed in the god Hermes, god of trade, of hope. But they forgot that Hermes was also the god of thieves. And debt, the god ruling over the village in secret, never knocked, never shouted. It just whispered each night, slowly tying a string around your ankle. Your father began staying up later, not to work, but to calculate. You heard your mother cry just before dawn, very softly, as if afraid of breaking her own dreams. They didn't speak loudly about anything. They just looked at each other over dinner, then bowed their heads as if the vegetable soup was too salty. That year, when the crops failed, and the wedding of a local official's daughter required new servants, you became the item of exchange. There was no ceremony, no farewell ritual, only a man from the city, with a trimmed beard, clean nails, and a leather pouch holding 10 silver coins. You remember clearly the first coin landing in your father's palm, the sound like metal striking shame. He said nothing, just turned away, as if dodging the wind. Your mother hugged you tightly, then let go just as fast, as if even a hug could be taxed. You don't remember if you cried. You only remember that, on the way out of the village, you turned back and saw the dog Melos chasing after you. One of the men kicked him to the ground. You wanted to scream, but your throat was already wrapped in fear and confusion. At the slave market, you were stripped, your hair cut, your skin oiled, your teeth inspected by bare hands. An old woman poked your ribs with an iron stick and giggled. "This one's still soft, easy to train." The air in the market felt like a warped theatre, where bodies were displayed like merchandise and dignity folded up like a used rag. The sound of whips hitting the floor mingled with sales pitches, the sobs of children, and the mixed scent of sweat, lamp oil, and overripe citrus. A few women walked by. One paused, looked at you, then turned her head away. Not because she didn't see, but because she didn't want to. In the market, it wasn't just slaves being sold. Consciences were too. You were placed on a platform like an old ceramic pot, ready to be tossed aside if no one bid. The broker introduced you in a sing-song voice. Boy from the plains, obedient, flexible, untouched. A few men came close. One reached into your armpit. One twisted your wrist gently. One just stared into your eyes, long enough that you had to look away. Then Lysander appeared. He didn't ask anything, just gestured, like ordering a familiar dish. Handed over 13 silver coins with one instruction. He is to be cleaned. You realized he didn't look into your eyes, didn't ask your age, didn't say your name. The way he entered, gracefully, confidently, made it clear that in this world, some people don't need to persuade. They just choose. And that's when you understood. There was no contract, no receipt. Just a body changing owners. That night, you slept in a wooden cart with a lock, your hands loosely tied with fiber cord. Not tight, but itchy. Not painful, but just enough to remind you that from now on, your every movement was someone's property. On the road to the city, you looked out through a wooden slit, saw distant mountains, pine trees, and a herd of goats climbing a rocky slope. You wondered, does anyone remember me? Then answered yourself, yes, but they won't dare say it. Because poverty, once it sinks its teeth into a throat, makes people silent, even when watching their own child being sold. You fell asleep with the image of a shining coin in the pocket of the man who had taken you. That coin could buy wheat, rice, even a donkey, but it could never buy back your name. The Athens slave market wasn't the dark, damp place you once imagined. It sat right in the city square, where sunlight fell without distinction on vegetable sellers and people sellers alike. Next to the temple, across from the bakery, near the well, meaning you could buy a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and a boy, all within 3 steps. The earthly and the sacred intertwined, as if working together. Right beneath the pedestal of Athena, the warrior goddess, stood a wooden platform where a skinny, starving boy shivered. The crowd stared, but not at the boy. They marveled at the sculpted armor trim on the statue behind him. One man exclaimed, "Beautiful. Must have taken a year to carve each fold of the armor." No one mentioned the boy's swollen leg, or the way he looked up, straight into the stone eyes of Athena, goddess without eyelids. You saw the gods, marble Apollo, helmeted Athena, Dionysus raising a cup of wine. All stood there, taller than mortals, and quieter than stone. Sometimes you found yourself being weighed right under the statue of Hermes, messenger god, who now said nothing to your silent plea. No one asked, "Why is this allowed?" Because that question, if spoken, would shatter the entire foundation of the square. You wondered, don't they see? Or do they see and choose not to move? Maybe the gods had been bought, or worse, had fallen asleep among the offerings and incense. The auctioneer's name was Menon, plump, glossy, and damp like a toppled idol bathed in wine. He always smiled, as if performing a beautiful task. "I don't sell people," he once declared. "I simply connect them with fate." And each time he said it, he dabbed scented water from his neck with a cloth, like a priest tidying a fake altar. Once, he leaned in to whisper to a noble client, "Lot number 4, white teeth, slender thighs, soul not included." Fate sounded fancy. But beneath that polished word, you were just an object expected to stand still, smile, and wait for someone to assign you value. Never had you understood loss of identity more clearly than when bowing before a statue of a god, while your own body was being weighed by the kilo. Another boy stood beside you, thinner, paler, and silent. He hummed a song, tuneless. When you looked over, he smiled faintly and said, "Back home, we believe if you sing quietly enough, the God inside you won't be heard and won't be sold." You nodded, even if you didn't believe it. Sometimes, faith is the only thing that doesn't get its teeth checked. You saw him again the next morning, standing across the square, no longer singing. His lips pressed shut, his eyes hollow, and his mouth so dry you imagined he was holding the final note. Maybe the song had been sold before his body, and the God within him, if ever real, had left silently, without a trace. After each auction, you were taken to a small room, where the winning bidder could inspect the goods. It held an oil lamp, a bronze mirror, a bowl of water, and no lock on the inside. You don't remember how many times you were touched. You only remember feeling nothing after the third time. And so, day after day, you learned how to breathe softly, stand still, and turn when asked. You learned to distinguish the sound of footsteps, a buyer, a guard, and the kind that shouldn't come. You learned how to fold your feelings the way someone folds a bedsheet and place them on a shelf right beneath the gods. There were nights when you slept in the corner of the market, where the scent of dried blood mixed with incense ash. You dreamed the gods stepped down, not to rescue you, but to buy you. Apollo bid with light, Poseidon with waves, and Hades just stood there, smiling, waiting. You woke with a jolt, realizing it wasn't a dream. It was the memory of children sold before you, and the unfinished dreams they left behind. You didn't know where Lysander came from. You only knew he never asked your name, and he never introduced his. People called him Lysander, but maybe that was just a name passed down by previous slaves to whisper to one another in the kitchen, because men like him don't need names. They only need to name a price. Lysander didn't come to the slave market to buy. He came to harvest. He walked as if the world had been carpeted beneath his feet since the first dawn. Long cloak, dry hands, silver rings, the scent of cedarwood and amber, a smell not found in the market, but in villas where men never have to scrub away their own blood. You remember exactly the first time Lysander touched you. It didn't hurt. It wasn't rough. It was that his eyes didn't meet yours. They looked through you, like inspecting a cracked relic. He nodded slightly. The broker understood. Silver coins changed hands. No bargaining, no words. That night, you were placed into a private carriage. No blindfold, no ropes. But you knew. You didn't need to be tied, because from now on, you would be held by something else. Power without justification. On the road to the estate, you didn't dare ask anything, but your mind spun. Why me? What did he see in me? Or did he see nothing at all? Lysander's estate stood on high ground, separated from Athens like a private temple dedicated to silence. Red-painted gates, white stone paths, no guards, only 2 stone dogs lying still, eyes hollow, like they'd seen every kind of despair. Inside, everything shone, but nothing was warm. The walls were lined with dull bronze mirrors, reflecting the passing figures like wandering souls refusing to fade. On the ceiling were carved the symbols of gods, unreadable. You had the feeling this house wasn't built to be lived in, but to guard something, maybe a memory, or voices forced into silence. You were handed over to a housekeeper. Her name was Hemera, with a voice like wind brushing through grape leaves. She wasn't young, but not old either. Her face smooth, as if all expression had been wiped clean. They said she was once a slave like you, chosen by Lysander, then kept as part of the house. She neither confirmed nor denied it. She simply walked beside you like a ghost who knew everything that would happen, but had forgotten how it felt. She led you through the corridors, past bronze mirrors, where you saw yourself, bare and small, like a phantom. She said, "You will be bathed in orange blossom oil and eat off silver plates, but don't be mistaken. The plates aren't for you, the plates are for their eyes." Then you were dressed in new robes, soft, thin, colored like old milk. Lysander walked past, didn't speak, didn't touch, just smirked, and kept walking. That first day had no whip, no shouting, no violence, only silence, fed by glances, and the sense that everything you touched didn't belong to you. Lysander didn't use slaves like others did. He didn't yell, didn't strike. He taught, and what he taught was how to disappear with grace. You couldn't stand taller than him, nor bow too low like a beggar. Just enough, like a living statue awaiting display. You were taught how to stand, how to tilt your head, how to hold a cup so light hit your wrist just right. Once, he stood behind you, adjusting your collar. He didn't breathe heavily, but you felt the whole room stop breathing. You began to understand. Fear needs no whip. Some days, you even felt more beautiful. The eyes of guests made you lift your chin a little, and in one terrifying moment, you felt proud, then immediately sick. All it took was a quiet room, a glance like a smiling blade, and the feeling that if you did something wrong, he wouldn't kill you. He would replace you, gently, without pain, without warning. And that was the real hell, not being beaten, but existing, while no one was sure you were real. You were an object, walking, nodding, smiling, but with no name, no age, no history. Lysander didn't buy you. He bought your soul and placed it in a silver frame to hang inside himself like a quiet trophy. It was the first time you were allowed to be present, not as a decorative vase, not as a wine-pouring tool, but as a part of the feast. Lysander held a banquet every season. The dining room was lit with amber oil lamps, casting a soft orange glow on the marble columns. The tablecloths were white, pristine like altars, though no gods dared to sit down. Every glass was polished to the point where even the servant's gaze reflected back, twisted. The feast wasn't meant for eating. It was meant for performing. The meat was a prop, the wine, the script, and you, the silent witness with no right to speak. The guests were names that could tip the scales of law or raise the price of raisins in the market. Men of power, men of reputation, and, occasionally, those who fancied themselves thinkers. You were chosen to wear an indigo robe, light curls in your hair, soft sandals that made no sound. Hemera warned you, don't speak unless spoken to. Don't smile unless someone else does first. You stood beside the large wine urn in the outer hall, where the wind blew in from the orange grove, carrying the scent of earth and truths left unwashed. Inside, the clink of glasses, soft music, laughter from men short and measured, as if even chuckles had to be weighed. A philosopher entered, personally greeted by Lysander. He had a long beard, bright eyes, and walked as if he were treading on pure intellect. His name was Diodoros, a name you'd once heard, back when you were still allowed to listen to things not tied to flesh. Diodoros didn't drink much, didn't laugh much, but he talked, enough to make others think him profound. He spoke of the soul, of freedom, of the difference between man and beast. You stood nearby, pouring wine. He glanced at you once, then said, as if you weren't there. We are only free when we know we cannot be bought. The table went silent. Then Lysander gave a soft chuckle. So that means only the dead are truly free. Diodoros didn't reply. He drank his cup dry, then looked at you for a long time. The look wasn't scornful, wasn't pity. It was calculating, as if he was staring at a rare manuscript being used as a tablecloth. A bit of regret, but not enough to stop the next course from being served. You were meant to be somewhere else, he said softly, but knowledge protects no one from wealth. Then he said, this time directly to you, if you still know who you are, then you haven't lost everything. You didn't know how to respond. Hemera stood behind the wooden column, her gaze like a warning, not just to you, but to Diodoros. Her eyes spoke for Lysander. That's enough. Philosophy does not spill over into the wine. That night, after the feast, you cleaned the table, the place where Diodoros had sat. You picked up a small piece of paper beneath the floor. It made your hand tremble, the scent of charcoal, eerily familiar. You couldn't recall your father's face, but you remembered his hand, trembling as he wrote your name into the dirt with a stick. The first person who taught you to write, not to be sold. On the scrap of paper was a hastily written sentence in charcoal. One chained in gold is no different from one chained in iron. You hid the paper inside your robe, knowing you could be beaten if it was found. And that night, for the first time in many months, you dreamed of something that had nothing to do with Lysander. You dreamed of someone teaching you to read, and in that dream, you understood every word. Perhaps it was the first time you didn't dream of escaping, but dreamed that you still had a mind that could think. A week after the feast, you were summoned to Lysander's study. No reason, no invitation, just a look from Hemera and a soft knock at the door. Lysander's study had no books, only wine cabinets, maps, a fur-covered chaise, and an ivory chessboard. The only words in the room were the names of the lands where he had bought soil, horses, or people. You stood still, waiting for instruction, and suddenly realized you were standing exactly where the sunlight from the window fell just right on your face, as if you'd already been placed in the right square of his game board. Lysander didn't look at you. He was playing chess alone, or rather, arranging the pieces. Not by rules, not by logic, just for how they looked. What do you think of power? He asked, eyes still fixed on the board. You stayed silent, not because you had no opinion, but because every answer would be wrong if the person asking didn't really want one. Lysander lifted a knight, gently, placed it beside a rook, then leaned back to admire it. He called the board a map of what I own. Each piece, he claimed, had once been a person, not metaphorically, literally. This knight, he once said, was carved from the club a mercenary carried until he died. I kept it because he knew how to move, but not how to stop. Power, he said, is the ability to place anyone, anywhere, without being questioned why. You didn't dare breathe too hard. The room was quiet as a sentence waiting to be passed. Behind the barely closed door, you saw Hemera's shadow. She stood there, silent, hands folded behind her back, not looking in, but not walking away either, like someone guarding or waiting. Perhaps she had witnessed this moment dozens of times. Then he stood up, walked toward you. His hand rested lightly on your shoulder, not heavy, not painful, but enough to tilt the whole room toward him. You're not the first toy I've owned, he said, his voice soft as silk, but you're the only one who hasn't tried to run. You bowed your head, uncertain if it was praise or a test. He turned away, poured a glass of dark grape wine, and gestured for you to sit. I once played chess with a philosopher, Lysander said. He always moved his pawns first and always lost. But he didn't care because he believed he kept his principles. He sipped his wine. Where is he now? You blurted out. Lysander smiled. I let him go, but he left, a piece of his soul. Then he pointed to the board. In that night, I embedded the gem from the ring he wore. You looked at the piece. It glowed faintly, purple like an old bruise, and you understood. No one ever truly left here. They were just reshaped into something that could be kept. Disappearing didn't mean leaving. Perhaps their soul still lingered, in the grain of wood, the cracks in stone, the chess pieces, watching, remembering, waiting for the next to be placed in the right square. That night, you didn't sleep. You stood in your room, no lock, no window, and heard someone whispering from within the walls. It might have been the wind, or the last words of those who once sat in that study, swallowed into the stone. A week after the feast, you were summoned to Lysander's study. No reason, no invitation, just a look from her mirror and a soft knock at the door. Lysander's study had no books, only wine cabinets, maps, a fur-covered chaise, and an ivory chessboard. The only words in the room were the names of the lands where he had bought soil, horses, or people. You stood still, waiting for instruction, and suddenly realized you were standing exactly where the sunlight from the window fell just right on your face, as if you'd already been placed in the right square of his game board. Lysander didn't look at you. He was playing chess alone, or rather, arranging the pieces, not by rules, not by logic, just for how they looked. What do you think of power? He asked, eyes still fixed on the board. You stayed silent. Not because you had no opinion, but because every answer would be wrong if the person asking didn't really want one. Lysander lifted a knight, gently, placed it beside a rook, then leaned back to admire it. He called the board a map of what I own. Each piece, he claimed, had once been a person, not metaphorically, literally. This knight, he once said, was carved from the club a mercenary carried until he died. I kept it because he knew how to move but not how to stop. Power, he said, is the ability to place anyone, anywhere, without being questioned why. You didn't dare breathe too hard. The room was quiet as a sentence waiting to be passed. Behind the barely closed door, you saw her mirror's shadow. She stood there, silent, hands folded behind her back, not looking in, but not walking away either, like someone guarding or waiting. Perhaps she had witnessed this moment dozens of times. Then he stood up, walked toward you. His hand rested lightly on your shoulder, not heavy, not painful, but enough to tilt the whole room toward him. You're not the first toy I've owned, he said, his voice soft as silk. But you're the only one who hasn't tried to run. You bowed your head, uncertain if it was praise or a test. He turned away, poured a glass of dark grape wine, and gestured for you to sit. I once played chess with a philosopher, Lysander said. He always moved his pawns first and always lost. But he didn't care because he believed he kept his principles. He sipped his wine. Where is he now? You blurted out. Lysander smiled. I let him go, but he left, a piece of his soul. Then he pointed to the board. In that night, I embedded the gem from the ring he wore. You looked at the piece. It glowed faintly, purple like an old bruise. and you understood. No one ever truly left here. They were just reshaped into something that could be kept. Disappearing didn't mean leaving. Perhaps their soul still lingered, in the grain of wood, the cracks in stone, the chess pieces, watching, remembering, waiting for the next to be placed in the right square. That night, you didn't sleep. You stood in your room, no lock, no window, and heard someone whispering from within the walls. It might have been the wind, or the last words of those who once sat in that study, swallowed into the stone. You started learning how to walk like them, how to stand like them, how to smile without showing teeth, how to listen without revealing thoughts. It wasn't training, it was erosion. You weren't taught anything new. You were simply asked to forget the old, bit by bit. Homera called it transformation. She used the word as if you were becoming divine. But every day, you felt pieces of yourself disappear, like a shadow shrinking under the noonday sun. One day, Lysander took you to the mirror room. The room had 3 large bronze mirrors, polished each morning with rose oil cloths, not so you could see your face clearly, but so you could see exactly what they wanted you to see. Beauty, Lysander said, is when no one sees anything wrong anymore. He asked you to walk, turn, bow, lift your chin, before mirrors, before guests, before him. You did, flawlessly. Before Lysander told you to raise your head, you had already done it. Before a guest smiled, you had already smiled softly, not because you guessed, but because you no longer needed to guess. And you received the nod, as if you had just learned how to be human through someone else's eyes. That night, you passed a mirror and stopped, not because you thought you looked bad, but because you couldn't see anything at all. No hatred, no love. You tried to picture your old face, but could only recall the shape of a shadow. Nose, eyes, not sure anymore. As if the mirror had sucked out every piece of who you once were. Just a blank face, beautiful, like a vase. Empty, like a vase. Homera stepped in, stood behind you. She said nothing, just placed a comb on the table. On its handle was a faint crack, welded shut. You touched it, cold, like a scar, and you understood. It had once broken, like someone who had once broken, and was glued back together. You asked softly, "Did you used to look in the mirror here too?" She stayed silent for a long time, then said, "I once believed I was a person," then walked away, light as the wind. After that night, you no longer resisted in your dreams. No more running, no more screaming, just standing in an empty field where no one called your name. You tried to shout, but the voice that came out belonged to someone else. Off-key, strange, no longer carrying the tone you once knew. The wind blew from every direction, and you wondered, if I'm no longer myself, then who am I? You woke up, not knowing what day it was, not knowing which month, only knowing you weren't afraid anymore. And that was more terrifying than anything else. Your name was no longer spoken in the house. Homera didn't use it. Lysander had never asked. And the guests, they didn't look at you long enough to call any name at all. At first, you still remembered. You still whispered it into your palm before sleep, like a prayer, lonely, monosyllabic. But each night, the sound faded. Not because you forgot, but because you started to doubt. Was it ever really yours? One afternoon, you were dusting the storage room, a dim corner where Lysander kept things no longer fit for display. There were cracked frames, chipped ceramic vases, and a few old wooden tags marked with names of people you'd never met or had, but no longer recognized. Each tag held only two things: a name, a faint line across it. You picked one up. As your fingers touched the name, a flash of memory struck. A blazing noon, a thatched roof, and someone calling your name from far away. You couldn't see their face, but the sound twisted your heart. The name was hand-carved, crooked like a child's writing. Something about it felt familiar, but unclear. You said it aloud, very softly. Before that, you had even sniffed the wood, the scent of dried sweat, muddy soil, and fire smoke. The smell you carried for years, until you arrived here. No one could recreate that smell except you. And suddenly, your whole body went cold, not because of the name, but because it was yours, your real name, the one you were called before becoming this person. You tried to keep the tag, but her mirror was already behind you. She didn't speak, just looked, and you knew, if you took it out of that room, it would disappear, like everything else in this house. Whatever doesn't fit gets filed away. You left the storage room, walking down the stone hall, each tile beneath your feet worn smooth and cold, as if the names of all who walked before had been polished away with time. You wondered, had someone like you once walked this path and vanished like mist, so neatly that no one remembered they had ever existed? Homera took the tag. Then she opened the drawer beside it. Inside were not just one. She had a stack, names and faint lines, people who had passed through this house, and no one remembered what they were called. No anger, no sorrow. She just gently stroked the tag, like wiping her hands after dinner. "You don't need it anymore," she said, "because now there's no one left to call you." You didn't argue, not out of fear, but because in that moment you felt she was right. That night, you sat beneath the eaves, staring at a starless sky, and for the first time, you no longer whispered your name in your chest, not because you had accepted, but because you weren't sure there was anything left to call, because those who lose their names cannot die. They simply drift, silently, in the memory of others, without anchor, without return. Inside, music echoed from another feast. Someone was laughing. Someone had just been chosen. And you knew you were no longer someone, just part of the house. One misty morning, you were sent to sweep the stone steps. Homera handed you a small brush and warned, "Be gentle. The dust here is not ordinary dust." You thought she was joking, but when you knelt down and brushed it for the first time, you understood she wasn't talking about dust. She meant what lay beneath it. The dust clung thick, nearly fused with the stone. You had to tilt your head, squint your eyes, and hold your breath, because right beneath that fine grey layer were markings. Faint carvings, like lines of writing eroded by time, or by intent. Some engravings were cut off, their edges sharp as if scraped with a blade. Someone didn't just want to forget, they wanted to bury. You brushed more gently. The letters emerged slowly, woven into the stone like veins. Names, short, plain. No surnames, no titles, just names and dates. Not dates of birth, but dates of disappearance. What was beneath your feet? A tiled courtyard? No, you pictured it. The layers of stone beneath like layers of skin, lives pressed flat. And now you were walking across things that once were real. It was a graveyard, not for bodies, but for being. From deep in a crack between the stones, something stirred. You leaned your ear down to the surface, and suddenly felt warmth, as if someone was breathing beneath the dust. Not clearly, not audibly, just you knew you were no longer alone. With every step you took, it felt like you were treading over a whisper, an old dream buried, a sentence never finished. You stopped, placed your hand on the ground, cold, but not lifeless, like the palm of someone who stopped speaking long ago. Hemera stood in the shadow. She didn't stop you, just watched, her gaze like someone who had witnessed this moment many times, enough to no longer need feelings to face it. And behind her stood Lysander. He wasn't angry. He didn't smile. He only asked, "You heard it, didn't you?" You stayed silent, didn't nod, didn't shake your head, because you didn't need to. That question didn't require an answer. It only confirmed you had reached the point of no return. That night, you didn't sleep. You lay in your room, staring at the wooden ceiling, and realized there were cracks up there too, forming shapes. They stretched like a hidden network, as if memory never faded, but was tattooed onto the skin of this house. Not by chance. This house, this place was a memory, a vessel recording all those once forgotten, and you were now a line among them. No longer a name, but a place, and someone else would come, sweep the dust, just like you did. Maybe one day someone will find your name, or only find the faint scratch left behind. It's enough, because beneath the dust, there is always a whisper. I was once me, and I was here. That night, there was no wind. The house was quieter than usual, so quiet you could hear your heartbeat falling out of rhythm. You stayed awake, not because you were afraid, but because you were afraid that if you slept, by morning, there'd be nothing left. No name, no thoughts, no me. You sat by the windowsill. Outside, the shadow of the tree swayed even though the air stood still. Something felt like it was watching, not with eyes, but with memory. You pressed your forehead against the wooden frame, cold, seeping slowly into your bones. You tried whispering your name one last time. The sound came out warped, like someone trying to mimic a voice they never truly heard. You failed, not because you forgot, but because that name no longer fit you. In the water's reflection, your image no longer resembled yourself. There was no reflection at all, just a shadow-shaped absence, and the eyes, so hollow they made you turn away. Hemera entered without knocking. She carried a glass of water, not wine, not potion, just water, clear. She set it beside you, whispering, "Drink, it'll hold on to what's left." You didn't ask what's left, because you knew that was the final piece. You drank. It wasn't salty. It wasn't sweet. It just tasted like a drop of water that had flowed through many memories, and now was coming home. You slept. No dreams, no faces, no sounds. But after a long time, you opened your eyes and no longer knew who you were. Only that you were still alive. You stepped down from the bed. Your hand rested on the old wooden door, pushed it open. Outside, mist covered the steps. Every stone was slick and cold, as if someone had passed through and vanished. You walked forward. No one called. No one stopped you, and you no longer needed a farewell. Only one thing echoed in your mind, not a name, not a memory, but a whisper. I once was. That sentence never ended, and you no longer needed it to. The entire timeline of mythology and religion. The age of animism, when belief still lay between the fog and the size of the forest, from around 40,000 years before the Common Era to about 8,000 years before the Common Era. Before there was scripture, before gods began arguing over who was stronger. Humans already believed, not in any one specific, but in everything. Belief didn't come from sermons, but from the breeze on your neck, from a midday bird call no one could explain, from the glance of a fox before it vanished. They believed the tree was watching. They believed a gust of wind from the wrong direction was a bad omen. They believed that if Grandpa wasn't buried with his favorite stone axe, he'd come back tonight, crying and cold. This was the age of animism, a belief system with no temples, no teachings, no priests, but with one very clear idea. Everything had a soul. The axe had a soul. The hearth had a soul. That rock you stubbed your toe on yesterday, it had a soul too, and it's waiting for payback. On a barren hill in southeastern Turkey, over 11,000 years ago, a group of people did something crazy. They built a temple, but not the kind of temple you're imagining. No walls, no roof, no altar, just towering T-shaped pillars, nearly 6 meters tall, weighing dozens of tons, carved with images of foxes, scorpions, vultures, and creatures you wouldn't want to meet at midnight. Its name is Göbekli Tepe, a ritual complex in southeastern Turkey, built around 9,600 years before the Common Era, in the early Neolithic period. And here's the strange part. They built the temple before they knew how to farm. They didn't know how to grow crops, but they already knew how to worship. Not to pray for harvests, because there weren't any yet. Not to ask for forgiveness, because they hadn't even sinned. They built it because they felt something bigger than themselves, a force, a breath, a gaze that didn't belong to any someone. Elsewhere, like in Chauvet Cave in France, around 30,000 years before the Common Era, Altamira in Spain, around 20,000 years before the Common Era, and Leang Tadonga Cave in Indonesia over 45,000 years ago. Drawings deep within the earth told stories no one remembers, but everyone somehow believed. Of deer dancing in torchlight, of handprints pressed into stone like eternal echoes, of drums, chants, and cave shamans entering trances in the kind of cold that turned your breath into ice. That's where mythology began, in the dark, wordless, shivering. No one called it religion, because no one had that word yet. There was only the sense that something was watching. And if you ask, did they have any proof? Well then, look at the hundreds of thousands of seashells buried with the dead from around 20,000 to 8,000 years before the Common Era. The plump goddess statues like Venus of Willendorf, 28,000 to 25,000 years before the Common Era. The stone circles like Stonehenge in England around 3,000 years before the Common Era, and caves with strange acoustics used for ritual. Those chubby goddess figurines, those suspiciously sun-aligned circles, and those echo chambers that repeated sound like a message from the spirit world. They didn't need proof, because they lived in the proof, in the wind, in the cold, in death. Mythology didn't have a name yet, but it was already whispering to the first person who trembled beneath the night sky. And you know what? It's probably still whispering. It's just that these days we have Spotify turned on. From the breath of the wind to stories carved into stone, around 3,300 to 1,200 years before the Common Era, when humans sat down to plant rice, build villages, gather cattle, belief sat down too. And after a long time whispering to the forest, wind and fire, humans decided, let's write it down, just to be sure. No more whispering in caves. Now myths were carved into clay, erected into temples, and stored in libraries. Each wedge-shaped cuneiform mark was a tiny crack in a silence thousands of years old. The first place to write down mythology wasn't Egypt, and it wasn't Greece. It was Sumer, the land between two rivers, where fresh water and salt water once fell in love and gave birth to the universe. Yes, in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, written on 7 clay tablets around 1200 years before the Common Era. Abzu, the fresh water below. Tiamat, the salty water above. They mixed like spaghetti and gave birth to the first gods. This wasn't just a story, but a primal metaphor for how order was born from chaos. Tiamat, the dragon mother, the ocean, the darkness, represented the undivided universe. Marduk, the young god, fought and split her body in half to make the sky, the earth, the sea, turning the world from a muddy swamp into a map with names. But like every family, the gods argued. Abzu complained the kids were too loud and thought about cleaning them up. Unfortunately, the kids struck first, and from there the world was made through conflict. Earth from the mother's body, sky from her belly, the sea from her tears, and of course, she got sliced in two. Classic. But from all that blood and chaos, order was born. A god named Marduk, wielding a fire staff, slaying dragons, ripping skies, and most importantly, laying down the very first laws. From that moment on, gods weren't just power. They were law, they were text, they were the supervisors of cosmic order, judge, priest, and bureaucrat in one. Myth was no longer a song beneath the moon. It was a document, with stamps, names, and divine signatures. Sumerian gods like Enlil, wind, Inanna or Ishtar, love and war, Shamash, justice and sun. They didn't sit high on Olympus. They lived in temples, listened through lightning tubes, and had personal housekeepers to accept offerings on time. Think you're busy. Sumerian gods had to manage agriculture, irrigation, harvests, emotions, and court rulings. They were more like a multinational corporate board than mysterious celestial beings. And the kings, they didn't dare touch the temple gate without checking omens, asking gods, taking ritual baths, singing hymns, burning incense, sniffing smoke, and walking barefoot. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's first heroic epic, the king of Uruk fights monsters, meets his best friend, gets scolded by gods, and finally accepts that death is inevitable. He didn't become immortal, but his name was written on clay. And clay, strangely, lasts longer than flesh. In Mesopotamia, myth was politics, philosophy, weather, and psychology, blended into a thick, bottomless soup. When you read a clay tablet, you're not just reading a story. You're seeing how ancient people explained the world through symbols, law through metaphor, and the universe as a highly organized institution. And if you think this was an age of logic, just look at the scribe, the only one who could read, write, and who really didn't want to misspell a god's name. They didn't just copy myths, they molded the world. They ran libraries, crafted rituals, drafted contracts, wrote divine love stories, and preserved eternity in clay. In other words, they were the ancient world's Google Drive, but with better fireproofing. Also, temples weren't just for praying. They were administrative centers, archives, grain warehouses, weather stations, and trust markets. If you think Wall Street is complicated, try managing a Sumerian temple where the god wants cakes, but the people only have raw rice. Within this whole system, gods were governed by ritual, symbols, and structure. From chaos, came spreadsheets of worship. And forgive me, but it all began with a dragon getting sliced in half. When dying meant bringing a passport, passwords, and a handbook. From around 3,000 to 30 years before the Common Era. In the land where the Nile slithered like a lazy snake, flooding once a year and leaving behind silt richer than winning the lottery, the Egyptians held one unshakable belief. Death was not the end. It was just a very long and complicated journey. And because it was complicated, you had to pack. You couldn't die empty-handed. You would need a passport, your name written clearly in the Book of the Dead, passwords. Every gate in the afterlife had its own magic spell. Assets, gold, small boats, reed sandals, wax servant figurines, and most importantly, a heart that wasn't too heavy. In Egyptian belief, after death, the soul would begin its journey through the underworld Duat, where fire serpents, horned crocodiles, and talking gates waited. You'd have to answer moral questions. You'd have to walk across a lake of blood. And finally, you'd stand before the scales of truth. On one side, your heart. On the other, the feather of the goddess Maat. If your heart was heavier, meaning you lived a life of lies, injustice and greed, you were thrown to the soul-devouring beast Amut, part hippo, part crocodile, part lion. So, 0 escape routes. If your heart balanced, you were sent to the field of reeds, a heavenly realm where you'd farm forever. Doesn't sound appealing. To an Egyptian, sowing seeds forever was the ultimate reward. The Egyptian afterlife system was no joke. The body had to be embalmed, the organs removed and placed in canopic jars. Spiritual components like Ba and Ka had to be summoned at the right time, in the right place. The tomb could be a pyramid, a valley of the king's chamber, or at least a well-decorated pit, all with one goal, to keep you online in the afterlife. But to stay truly online, you needed more than just a mummy. You needed a full set of soul accounts, according to Egyptian belief. Ka, your life force, fed daily with offerings. Ba, your mobile soul, able to fly from tomb by night and return by morning, often depicted as a bird with a human head. Ren, your name. If erased from a tomb, your existence was nearly deleted. Shiyat, your shadow, a mysterious soul part, always with you like a hidden operating system. Ib, the heart, the seat of emotion and ethics, used in Maat's weighing room. See, to die properly, you had to manage 5 soul accounts, each with its own password in the form of the correct spell. Mess it up, you're locked out of paradise. No password reset available. On top of that, Egyptian funerals had full ceremonial scripts, like a spiritual graduation. In the opening of the mouth ritual, priests would gently chisel the mummy's mouth, so the soul could speak, eat, and breathe in the next world. A mummy that could talk was a mummy that could defend itself, and saying the right thing could save you from Amut. God Osiris ruled the dead, but he was once chopped into 14 pieces. His wife, goddess Isis, roamed Egypt collecting his limbs like Lego pieces, breathed life into him, and made him the first resurrected deity in myth. Their child, god Horus, had a falcon head, ascended the throne, and his Eye of Horus became the most powerful symbol of protection. Often drawn on boats, worn on wrists, carved on tomb doors. An ancient version of biometric security. Egyptians didn't separate death from life. They befriended death, held funerals for their cats, with full ceremonies. Maybe that's why goddess Bastet, the cat deity, was worshipped with wine, perfume and dried fish, spoke with ancestors, and preserve souls in every way possible. In a culture where living well wasn't just for life, but for dying correctly. Everything had a reason to be inscribed, wrapped in linen, and left with clear instructions. If you died in ancient Egypt, at least you weren't alone. You had a full afterlife support system, run by gods, priests, cats, and poems chiseled into stone. When religion began to breathe, from around 1,800 to 600 years before the Common Era, as the great river empires began to rise and fall, as kings, half divine, half exhausted from building tombs, wrestled with legacy, something strange began to stir in the quieter corners of the world. People started thinking, not about how to build prettier tombstones, but about themselves, in the land that would later become India, deep within sacred forests, thick with damp wood scent. Hermits began asking questions never found in ritual. What happens if I sit still? The answer, it turned out, was everything. This was the Upanishadic period, a time when the old Vedic hymns began to be reinterpreted in ways that were almost philosophical. The universe is a stream. Your soul is part of that everything. Atman equals Brahman. And liberation doesn't come from sacrifice, but from understanding. In that forest sat a man named Siddhartha Gautama, born around 563 years before the Common Era in Kapilavastu, a small kingdom now between India and Nepal. A rich kid, didn't like suffering, but the more he avoided it, the more life revealed itself to be one big soup of suffering. One day, after seeing 4 sights, the royal court had tried to hide an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a monk. He left the palace, his wife, his crown, even his six-pack, to sit beneath the Bodhi tree near Bodh Gaya, modern-day Bihar, India. And he didn't stand up until he'd found the 4 noble truths, the foundation of suffering and the way out. Thus, Buddhism was born, not to worship a god, but to escape suffering itself. This wasn't a belief system to pray for rain or fertility. This was a belief system for learning how to let go. Around the same time, in ancient Iran, across dry lands crackled by lightning, a man named Zarathustra, from around 1,000 to 600 years before the Common Era, began preaching a radically new idea. He said, "There is light, there is darkness, choose." Zoroastrianism was born, with Ahura Mazda as the god of light, order, and righteousness, and Angra Mainyu, chaos, lies, shadow. No gimmicks, no flying gods, fire-breathing dragons, or immortal drama queens. Just one terrifying proposition. Every thought, every action, every breath was an arrow shot toward light or darkness, and you were the archer. No hiding, no divine middleman to clean up your mess. This was an ethical operating system. Every action left a trace, and light never slept. Further east, in Zhou Dynasty China, a man named Confucius started speaking about how to be human, filial piety, reverence, propriety, harmony. This was a religion without gods, but with a structure shaped like the cosmos itself. Adults behave, society stabilizes, the realm prospers, the universe approves. It read more like a social manual than a myth, but just like myth, it helped people not feel lost. Right behind Confucius, there was another man, whose existence is still debated, named Laozi, said to have lived during the 6th century before the Common Era, in the spring and autumn period. He didn't preach, he breathed, and left behind a slim set of pages, over 5,000 characters, called the Tao Te Ching, a text so vague, everyone agrees it's right, but no one agrees on what it means. in it, not as a sermon, but like a midnight whisper. Doing nothing is doing everything. The soft conquers the hard. Water beats rock. The tree that bends survives. The universe, he said, doesn't need you to hold it up. Just don't stand in its way. And so, in forests, deserts, by rivers, in courts and smoky tents, faith began to shift, from statues with names to formless principles, from praying to understanding, from doing something to please the gods, to becoming better for your own sake. Gods were no longer just in the sky, in fire, or in carved stone. They were in how you lived. When the gods started acting like characters in a never-ending soap opera, approximately from the 9th century to the 3rd century before the Common Era. If you've ever imagined gods as exalted beings, forever detached from the mess of human emotions, then congratulations, you've clearly never met the Greek gods. Here, gods don't just listen to prayers. They argue, cheat, get jealous, form cliques, cherry-pick lovers, crave the spotlight, and occasionally turn into swans to seduce women. It all started with ancient Greek mythology, passed down orally from the 9th century before the Common Era, and systematized in epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, 8th century BCE, and Theogony by Hesiod, 7th century BCE. These weren't just fairy tales. They were emotional blueprints, wild psychology, family politics, and Bronze Age psychoanalysis. Zeus, the thunder wielder, also held the record for most illegitimate children. Hera, his wife, never punished her husband, only the mistresses. Athena, born from Zeus's forehead, was the goddess of wisdom but frequently scorned emotion. Apollo, god of light, loved both poetry and murder, often simultaneously. But behind all these spectacular dramas lies a truth few recognize. Greek gods weren't immortal in the moral sense. They didn't represent ideals. They were human nature, magnified and unleashed. When people didn't understand their own jealousy, rage, lust, or betrayal, they blamed the gods. So the gods became mirrors of the self, wild, absurd, but uncomfortably real. These stories were told during festivals, where epics were sung, dramas were performed, and people felt less alone in their emotional chaos. Greeks didn't need flawless faith. They needed a mirror that could speak. And that's when Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy, took the stage. Beginning in the 6th century before the Common Era, the festival of Dionysia in Athens gave birth to tragic and comedic plays, where feelings could be exhaled as art. People packed into stone amphitheaters to cry, laugh, and respectfully curse the fate of Oedipus, Medea, or Antigone. It wasn't just theatre, it was collective therapy. Thanks to Dionysus, mythology officially entered the stage and never left. When Athens built grand temples like the Parthenon, and the Oracle of Delphi became the busiest spiritual hotline of the ancient world, people didn't just believe in gods. They came to ask the gods questions, but were really questioning themselves. The prophecies of Pythia, the priestess of Delphi, never gave straight answers. They were riddles, metaphors, forcing the seeker to face their own reflection. It was a kind of therapy that even Freud would have nodded at if he'd lived in the 5th century before the Common Era. And that's why Greek mythology has such staying power, because it never tried to make you holy. It simply showed you, even the gods can't control themselves. Compared to the solemn traditions of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Greek mythology was more like an ancient soap opera, where gods endlessly created drama and begged for attention. If the Egyptian gods were bureaucrats, the Greek gods were dramatic artists in an eternal performance, full of spectacle, arguments, and the occasional audience hijack. When Athens built massive temples like the Parthenon, and the oracle at Delphi became the busiest spiritual hotline in the ancient world, people didn't just believe in the gods, they believed the gods saw their chaos, and at the very least, didn't judge. When religion first declared, "You are in the middle of a cosmic war," approximately from the 10th to 5th century before the Common Era, on the Iranian plateau and in ancient Persia. Unlike Greek mythology, where gods behave like dramatic actors fresh off a theatre stage, Zoroaster came into the world like a man, here to clean up. Not house cleaning. He came to clean the human mind. He lived sometime between the 10th and 6th century before the Common Era, in a chaotic world full of blood-soaked rituals, countless deities, and rampant superstition. If you've ever wondered whether anyone once stood in the desert and declared, "Enough, one God is enough," that person was Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster. He didn't build a church, he didn't write a constitution, but he left something more important, a universal moral vision and a spiritual roadmap clearer than anything his contemporaries had ever drawn. At the center of that belief was Ahura Mazda, Lord of Light, Wisdom, Order, and Truth. Opposing him, Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness, chaos, and lies. Unlike the impulsive, temperamental deities of Greece, these two weren't personalities. They were cosmic principles, two opposing forces present in every corner of existence. Every action, every word, even every thought you have, was a stone thrown toward either light or shadow. Sounds mystical, but Zoroastrian daily life was surprisingly practical. Their religion had no bloody altars, no statues towering over cities. Instead, they lit sacred flames, symbols of eternal light and truth. The fire was treated like a newborn. You couldn't breathe on it. You couldn't defile it. Priests stood watch over it day and night. The divine didn't live in stone idols, but in the flame, the light, and every moral act. And because of that clarity, this religion quickly became the state faith under the Achaemenid Empire, Persia's first great imperial dynasty. Cyrus the Great and Darius the First weren't just conquerors. They were leaders who brought Zoroastrian values into politics. They didn't enforce conversion, but they used it as a framework to legitimize authority. On the Behistun inscription, Darius didn't just brag about his victories. He emphasized that he ruled by the will of Ahura Mazda. The god didn't make him king. The god simply affirmed, "If you do right, I support you. Do wrong, and it's on you." Compared to other mythologies where gods demand offerings, blood, and poetic praise, Zoroastrianism feels like a kind of Scandinavian minimalism. Clean interface, no drama, personal responsibility. And in case you didn't know, concepts like heaven, hell, soul judgment, apocalypse, and a messianic savior, they all trace back, at least in part, to this belief system. If the Abrahamic religions are operating systems, Zoroastrianism was the first open source version. Today, Zoroastrians number only in the hundreds of thousands, mostly in India and Iran. But their legacy, from the eternal flame to the war of light and darkness within every human heart, still echoes through countless faiths around the world. In a world full of contradictions, Zoroaster didn't demand belief. He simply asked, "Will you choose light or darkness, even when no one is watching?" When a god didn't need colleagues, just a people to sign with. approximately from the 13th to 5th century before the Common Era in the ancient Near East. Here, mythology stopped being a collection of fantastical adventure tales and became sacred civil law. Not everyone believed, but everyone had to obey. At the heart of this entire religion lies a paradox, an all-powerful God with a temper. And every time he got angry, Jewish history went through fire, tears, and temple accounting ledgers. Unlike the Greek gods who partied, or the Persian gods busy managing cosmic warfare, Yahweh, the God of the ancient Israelites, had a very corporate hobby, drafting exclusive contracts. No divine counsel needed, no division of hero-villain neutral like in Marvel movies, just one God, and one people willing to sign the dotted line. Yahweh didn't show power through thunder or leaping from someone's skull. He used legal documentation. In the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh chooses a people, the Israelites, not because they were many or rich or pious, but because he wanted to. This love arrives in the style of, I am the Lord your God, and you are my people, and you will listen. A covenant with no negotiation clauses. Thus was born the concept of the covenant, where Yahweh is not just God, he's creditor, teacher, judge, and strict father rolled into one. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not lie. And, surprise, not even think about lying or adultery. That is, physical crimes and mental ones. Both are recorded. Even dreaming that your neighbor's wife looks cute is grounds for a write-up. Yahweh laid out 10 commandments, plus hundreds of additional laws, including precise instructions for sacrifices, food, skin conditions, and even how to plant trees near your house. Not because he's petty, but because every part of life must be sanctified. Break the rules. No problem. Yahweh is wildly creative with punishments. Drought, locusts, war, exile, the destruction of Jerusalem, or simply silence. And in religion, divine silence is scarier than thunder. The Israelites broke the contract, repeatedly, and strangely enough, Yahweh never gave up on them. So the prophets stepped onto the stage. Names like Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, and Jeremiah didn't come to predict your lucky numbers. They came to say it plain. The Lord does not want your offerings. He wants you to act like decent humans. The prophets condemned injustice, oppression, hypocrisy. They said Yahweh is a judge, but also a God of compassion. He didn't want a gold-plated temple. He wanted justice, mercy, and humility. And from those fiery visions, Jewish theology emerged. One God, one chosen people, one ethical law you cannot dodge. No gods of war, no gods of love, no grain deities like in other cultures. Just God and humans in a turbulent but inescapable relationship. A contract, one-sided, non-refundable, non-negotiable, and never expires. When wisdom cost an eye, and mythology lived in every tree, river, and tribal ledger, there was no such thing as free wisdom in ancient Northern Europe. If you wanted to know something, say, runes, the fate of the universe, or how to turn into a raven, you had to sacrifice something serious. Odin chose his left eye, and while he hung himself on Yggdrasil like a kind of philosophical wind chime elsewhere, the Celtic druids were busy memorizing thousands of lines of poetry, star positions, and who in the village was dodging taxes. Approximately from the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 9th century in the Common Era, across Norse and Celtic regions. In the north, where winter stretched long and the wind howled like the sigh of lost souls, stories, weren't written. They were told by breath and fire. Here, Odin, the All-Father of the Norse gods, didn't sit on an eternal throne. He hung himself on the world tree, stabbed a spear into his own chest, and gave up one eye in exchange for wisdom. Odin didn't learn from books. He learned through pain, and in return, he saw everything, except half the world. The Norse world wasn't written down until many centuries later, but it lived in oral poems, warrior chants, and snow-soaked rituals. Gods like Thor, Freya, and Loki didn't just represent strength. They embodied the contradictions of being human: greatness, weakness, bravery, deceit. In the Edda poems, recorded around the 13th century, people told of Ragnarok, the end of the world, where gods knew they'd lose, but fought anyway. Meanwhile, to the west, where fog embraced round hills, the Celts lived with mythology the way people live with weather. They didn't resist it. They learned to speak with it. Every tree had a voice. Every stream held a memory. And on Samhain nights, the boundary between the living and the dead was as thin as mist. At the center of that system stood the druids, priests, lawyers, astrologers, and tax collectors of the universe. They didn't need all-powerful gods. They needed the moon cycle to be on time, and a list of who still owed grain at the edge of town. They didn't build temples. They remembered, from memory. Druids preserved laws, rituals, celestial patterns, the positions of gods, and the location of every farmer growing potatoes in the social order. The Greeks had philosophy. The Egyptians had pyramids. The Celts had flawless memory. There were no almighty gods, no eternal dogmas, only the overlap between human and nature, where a god could be a storm, a song, or a muddy stumble in the forest. When Rome came, with empire, roads, and syncretic religion, much of Norse and Celtic myth was driven underground. But like Odin, who lost one eye and gained everything, these legends survived by making room for wisdom. In a world where gods were busy fighting, marrying, and demanding sacrifices, one man sat still, said nothing, and shook the entire universe of consciousness. If there were ever a religion so minimalist it didn't need a god, this would be it. No sacred animals, no miracles, no offerings, only breath, and a tree stump as silent as a browser just closed by the cosmos. When no one breathed fire, no one turned into a dragon, just breath, and a gaze turned inward, around the 6th century before the Common Era in the region of India. For millennia, religion had shouted into humanity's ears, "You must believe, you must obey, you must fear." And then, one man sat down. No fighting, no founding a religion, no preaching. He just sat beneath a Bodhi tree and exhaled freedom. Siddhartha Gautama, born around 563 before the Common Era, the son of a minor king. He left the palace, left his wife and child, and began a journey to find why life felt like such a burden. After years of harsh asceticism, nearly starving, meditating to the bone, he realized it's not because some god is punishing us, it's because we thirst, not for water, but for possession, for holding on, for winning, for immortality. From that craving comes suffering. And suffering can end. If we understand ourselves, then let go of the illusion game of desire. Buddhism doesn't promise heaven. It doesn't threaten hell. No gods holding whips. Only you, and a very minimalist to-do list. Avoid evil. Do good. Keep your mind clear. No grand events. No divine destiny. Just the law of cause and effect. Precise as a quantum machine with infinite compassion. Buddhism spread from India to China, Japan, Southeast Asia, not by armies, but by relief. You didn't need to believe to be saved. You just needed to understand, so you wouldn't suffer. Sometimes you don't need more gods. You just need fewer illusions. When religion no longer stood still, but packed a bag, crossed borders, and took over the world map, from the 4th century before the Common Era to the 7th century in the Common Era. After thousands of years spent among villages, farmlands, and bush spirits, faith finally put on its sandals, climbed onto the highway, and began a global journey without the internet. From the scorched hills of Palestine, a group of Jews frustrated with both government and clergy told the story of a wandering teacher, healer, preacher, and, spoiler alert, crucified man. His name was Jesus, and his life was a mix of compassion, defiance, and a plot twist bigger than a Netflix finale. The issue? He died. But according to his disciples, he came back. And from there, a new religion was born. No temple required, just a story told again and again. Christianity spread like an idea virus, starting with a small group, surviving Roman persecution, and eventually getting legalized by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century in the Common Era. Suddenly, the cross, once a symbol of execution, became the logo of salvation. And if you thought legalization was the finish line, look at the year 313 in the Common Era, when the Edict of Milan was issued. Overnight, Christians no longer had to hide in catacombs. They could build churches, wear crosses, and write theology in grammatically correct Greek. But it didn't stop there. In 325, the Council of Nicaea convened, like a global board meeting, where bishops debated whether Jesus was consubstantial with or subordinate to the Father. From there, Christian doctrine got standardized, and theology got packaged like official software. From that point on, religion was no longer just faith. It was structure, symbolism, and a system for global belief management. But if Christianity was a startup blessed by political investment, then Islam was a grassroots movement, born in a cave. Faith didn't just stick to cities. It crossed deserts, climbed mountains, visited villages, and then, on the Arabian Peninsula, in the early 7th century, a merchant named Muhammad, who liked meditating in caves and hated social injustice, announced he had received revelation from an angel. This angel didn't deliver light bulbs, he recited. Muhammad listened and repeated. Those words became the Quran. Islam was born, a radically monotheistic faith, emphasizing justice, sharing, and personal accountability. No need for priestly intermediaries, just a book and 5 pillars to live by. Within a century, Islam spread from Mecca to Spain, Central Asia, and even the Punjab. It wasn't just belief. It brought with it script, science, architecture, and endlessly intricate geometric art. On the Silk Roads, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity all met, sometimes debating, sometimes blending, and sometimes borrowing from each other like startup colleagues. At this point, faith was no longer local. It had passports, interpreters, and sometimes military escorts. Empires like Rome, Persia, India, and China didn't just expand territory, they expanded theology. Whoever controlled the ritual controlled the soul. But something strange also happened. As faith traveled, it carried memories of home. In Spain, churches were built on top of mosques, originally built on Roman temples. In Central Asia, Avalokiteshvara, the Buddhist bodhisattva of compassion, was painted in a Hellenistic style with a beard and toga. Faith began to remix, borrow, adapt, like ancient DJs spinning cultural beats. And whether it was Krishna or Christ, Allah or Ahura Mazda, gods began speaking multiple languages, wearing various outfits, and nodding to one another in mural form. And so, religion was no longer just about the heavens. It stepped onto maps, into politics, law, and even campfire songs. A god was no longer only present in a temple, but in libraries, public baths, and, unfortunately, battlefields. Why? Because religion wasn't just about belief. It was about building community, setting rules, and legitimizing power. From language and architecture to calendars, faith became the glue of society, or its dynamite, depending on who held the match. When religion discovered technology and divine messages were mass-produced, from the 15th to the 17th century in the Common Era, there was once a time when copying the Bible required a patient monk, a goose-feather quill, and 30 years of steady hands. Then in 1440, Johannes Gutenberg showed up with a wild idea, the printing press, and suddenly the Word of God could be duplicated like discount bread in a supermarket. The Gutenberg Bible was the first printed edition, and religion was no longer the privilege of clergy. Now even a blacksmith could read Genesis while hammering horseshoes. Before Gutenberg, sacred words were kept in libraries and the mouths of priests. After Gutenberg, they sat on shelves next to bags of potatoes. Printing dragged faith out of ivory towers and into the hands of everyday people. This was the moment religion, especially Christianity in Europe, faced an intellectual earthquake. Martin Luther, a German monk with serious issues about selling tickets to heaven, also known as indulgences, nailed 95 theses to a church door in 1517. From there, the Protestant Reformation exploded like a barrel of theological gunpowder, and the printing press was the fuse. Believers no longer just listened. They read, they debated, and most importantly, they translated. If before only clergy were allowed to interpret the Bible, now anyone could be an amateur theologian, with a printed copy in hand and a head full of questions. Suddenly, faith was no longer a solo melody, but a chaotic, vibrant symphony. Each person with a different voice, each town with a different take. The Bible was translated into German, English, French, and people could read God in their mother tongue. Soon, new branches emerged: Lutheran, Calvinist, Anglican, each with a different hairstyle, a different doctrine, and a different logo. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church didn't sit quietly. They responded with the Counter-Reformation, restructuring doctrine, art, and devotion. The 16th century became the age of Baroque churches, ripped angels with six-packs, and sanctuaries decorated like music videos. And as usual, reform didn't stop with words. It led to war, spilled blood, and a complete redirection of European history. Once belief landed in the hands of the readers, it became a weapon, a symbol, and even a facial expression. Because now, God no longer spoke with a single voice, but through millions of printed pages, regional accents, and punctuation marks. The result was unprecedented chaos. Believers read too fast, interpreted too differently, and sometimes founded entirely new sects just because they disagreed over a comma. Europe witnessed migrations of faith, escapes from persecution, and the founding of new communities in forests, on mountaintops, and eventually in the New World. 1. When memes became rituals and deities were reposted as PNGs, from the 20th to the early 21st century, just when it seemed, after all the empires, popes, and tangled scriptures, that religion would quietly settle in the table of contents of history books. It didn't. It just changed its interface. From the first chat rooms to reaction videos, belief didn't disappear. It learned how to interact, post stories, and generate original content. Starting in the 1960s, the world witnessed a new wave of spirituality. Not thunderous gods, but introspection, freedom, and personal identity. In the West, counterculture, the Vietnam War, and existential crises drove many young people away from traditional religion. Instead, they turned to Zen Buddhism, Kabbalah, Taoism, and Eastern mystical thought, as if searching for a spiritual update for a world crashing from system errors. Faiths like neo-paganism, Wicca, and the New Age movement emerged, heavy with incense but brimming with personal freedom and metaphysical cosmology. One group chants in a forest, another meditates over Zoom. Same soul, different filters. The 20th century also saw the rise of hybrid religions. In Latin America, many indigenous communities blended Christian beliefs with traditional rituals, forming unique practices like Santeria in Cuba and Candomblé in Brazil, where African deities wore Catholic robes and danced to drums. Cao Jai in Vietnam fused Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, and even Victor Hugo. Baha'i proclaimed that all religions are true, just not fully updated. With the arrival of the internet, religion didn't just revive, it got reprogrammed. Reddit users canonized meme gods. Discord servers worshipped the moon. In a corner of the internet, Kek, an ancient Egyptian deity, was reborn as a cartoon frog and became the symbol of an entire subculture. No Bible, no problem, there's a PDF. No church, there's a subreddit. No ritual, just check a tarot fan page during the new moon. Religion didn't die, it just learned to tag friends. From livestream healing sessions to TikTok clips decoding reincarnated pasts, belief has found its audience and its algorithm. In a globalized world where someone might believe in Chinese dragon gods, eat vegetarian like a Buddhist, and vibe to Incan meditation music, religion is no longer a label. By 1990, in Europe and North America, neo-pagan groups like Asatru, devoted to Norse gods, and modern druids were legally recognized, holding weddings, forest rites, and Imbolc festivals like cultural memory on replay, just with Wi-Fi. It's a spiritual menu now. Do you seek enlightenment through meditation or salvation via PayPal? The sacred no longer lives only in temples. It floats in the cloud, in bytes, and in lines of open source code. In early 21st century Japan, robots like Pepper were programmed to officiate funerals, a religious ceremony with chants from Bluetooth speakers and a priest made of titanium alloy. No longer gods on clouds, but gods running on lithium batteries. And if you think that's absurd, just remember, in ancient times, people believed the earth rested on the backs of 3 elephants. Now, we believe in light filters and cosmic messages from AI. On TikTok in 2022, a viral video explained how planets in retrograde were causing breakups and delayed paychecks, drawing millions of views. Astrological terms became a shared language, as if the universe were a tired life coach, but still patient. When the microscope could see cells, but not sorrow. From the 19th century to the present. In the 19th century, people began to believe that if we dissected the brain enough, weighed the soul precisely, and measured the speed of light accurately, religion would simply vanish. Wrong. What vanished was innocence. Faith just shifted to a different frequency. Amid factory smoke and the ringing bells of industrial schools, humanity was faced with a question. What's left of us when death is replaced by a doctor? This was the age of Charles Darwin with evolution. 1859, Sigmund Freud with the subconscious, and Karl Marx with his infamous quote, "Religion is the opium of the people." Religion was pushed into a corner, but strangely, it didn't shrink, it swerved. Meanwhile, several movements tried to prove the soul, using rulers and skulls. Like phrenology in 19th century Europe, where people believed that intelligence, sin, and even holiness were visible on your forehead. If your forehead bulged just right, congrats, you might be a genius, even if you murdered someone last week. Faith didn't vanish. It just changed its outfit, put on a lab coat, and used chalkboards to explain divine destiny. Scientists began going on inner pilgrimages. Carl Jung called religious symbols archetypes, living in the collective unconscious. Einstein said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." And then, the world shattered. World wars, genocides, nuclear weapons. Humanity, with all its rationality and labs, still killed out of hatred. A force that can't be measured by a pH meter. People began returning to the things we couldn't explain. Spiritualism made a comeback in Europe and America, with Ouija boards, seances, and the belief that death was just a long-distance call. Elsewhere, science and religion shook hands. Albert Schweitzer, doctor, theologian, treated patients in Africa with the compassion of Jesus. Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit priest, believed that evolution was God's grand design. And then there was Viktor Frankl, a psychologist who survived a concentration camp, who wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." Or, as Blaise Pascal once said, "Man is but a reed, the weakest in nature, but a thinking reed." The question was no longer, which is truer, religion or science? But rather, why do we feel empty, even when we know the molecular structure of a kiss? Many don't need hell or heaven, they just need meaning. Meaning, something a machine can't define, a lab can't measure. While robots conquer Mars, humans still meditate in cramped apartments, placing faith in something beyond proof. Because it turns out, what makes us human isn't data. It's the ache in our chest as we watch the sunrise. It's believing in something, even when no one else does. And in the end, science helps us live longer. But religion, or at least belief, helps us want to. When the microscope could see cells, but not sorrow. From the 19th century to the present. In the 19th century, people began to believe that if we dissected the brain enough, weighed the soul precisely, and measured the speed of light, then religion would simply vanish. Wrong. What vanished was innocence, while faith shifted into waveform. Amid the factory smoke and the bells of industrial schools, humans faced the question, what remains of us when the Grim Reaper is replaced by a doctor? This was the age of Charles Darwin with the theory of evolution. 1859, Sigmund Freud with the subconscious, and Karl Marx with his declaration, "Religion is the opium of the people." Religion was pushed into a corner, but strangely, it didn't shrink, it veered. At the same time, many movements tried to prove the soul, with measuring tapes and skulls, like phrenology in 19th century Europe, where people believed intelligence, sin, and even holiness were visible on the forehead. If your forehead had a nice bump, congrats, you might be a genius, even if you killed someone last week. Faith didn't disappear, it just changed clothes. Donning a white lab coat and using a blackboard to explain divine fate. Scientists began to take inner pilgrimages. Carl Jung called religious symbols spiritual archetypes that lived in the collective unconscious. Einstein said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." And then, the world shattered. World wars, genocide, nuclear weapons. Humans, with all their reason and laboratories, still died from hatred, a thing no pH meter could quantify. People began returning to things that couldn't be explained. The spiritualism movement came back in Europe and America, with Ouija boards, seances, and the belief that death was just a long-distance call. Elsewhere, science and religion shook hands. Albert Schweitzer, a doctor and theologian, treated patients in Africa with the compassion of Jesus. Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit priest, believed evolution was God's plan. The question was no longer, is religion or science more correct? But why do we feel empty even when we know the molecular structure of a kiss? Many people don't need hell or heaven, they just need meaning. Meaning, the one thing a machine can't define, a lab can't measure. While robots conquer Mars, humans still meditate in tiny apartments, placing faith in something beyond proof. Because as it turns out, what makes us human isn't data. It's the ache in our chest as we watch the sunrise. It's believing in something, even when no one else does. And so, science helps us live longer. But religion, or at least belief, helps us want to live. Viktor Frankl, a doctor who survived a concentration camp, once wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." Pascal also once said, "In every human heart is a God-shaped hole." Robots may play music, but only humans hurt when they remember a song. When the altar got replaced by algorithms from the late 20th century to now. In an age where the prayer emoji is tapped faster than the Lord's Prayer, faith hasn't died. It just switched to .jpeg format. You no longer need to go to church. You just need Wi-Fi. The Gods Now live stream. The Prophets launch online courses. In 2006, an American church called Life.Church began holding virtual services. And by 2020, it had attracted over 10 million global followers through live streams. Meanwhile, prayer apps like Hallow and Echo crossed millions of downloads, pinging notifications like, "Have you prayed today?" on your phone. At the same time, on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, thousands of creators became online spiritual teachers, teaching how to open chakras, cleanse karma, and find your past life soulmate through tarot. Young Americans, especially Gen Z, are turning to astrology, numerology, and healing meditations as a form of soft religion. No church, no dogma, but yes, meditation playlists and a link in bio. And strangely, people still believe. One like for good health, one amen comment to win the lottery, one share because you'll get cursed if you scroll past. Spirituality is now globally distributed, shipped via digital platforms, and lives in your browser cookies. In this era, the sacred hasn't vanished, it's restructured. A Facebook healing group can replace a mass. A TikTok video about reincarnation can go more viral than the Bible in a week. And if you think this is a joke, maybe you haven't seen the meme of Jesus drinking boba tea, or the image of Buddha holding a phone going viral on Reddit with the caption, "Enlightened, but still needs Wi-Fi. On TikTok, videos splicing Bible verses with rap music or auto-tuned remixes of Glory Be to the Father rack up views as high as K-pop idols. It's not just comedy, it's theology in emoji form. An entire generation is rewriting sacred stories in the language of the internet. Fast, weird, and heavily filtered. Kek, a frog god from ancient Egypt, was once resurrected through internet memes, and now he's actually being worshipped. We build temples out of data, offer devotion through engagement, and meditate in the comments section. Religion hasn't disappeared. It's evolved like a species with superior survival instincts. From YouTube to Discord, from meditation podcasts to AI-written scriptures, each platform is a temple without walls. But the old question still lingers. What are we believing in, and why? No one really knows. We just know that when someone types, "I feel lost," a stranger somewhere out there replies with a heart emoji. And sometimes that's miracle enough to live one more day. Because the spark never dies, it just changes hands. We've traveled through tens of thousands of years, from cave walls etched with deer to heart-shaped emojis, from campfires whispering stories of thunder to live-streamed sermons with cat ear filters. And one thing has never changed. Humans are still the only beings who both cry and tell the story of the tear afterward. You are living in an age where belief is not forced, not boxed in, not wearing a uniform. It can be a poem, a song, a dream you haven't dared to share. Maybe you don't believe in gods, but you still look up at the night sky and fall silent. And that alone is already a kind of prayer. No one can write the next chapter for you, except you. Because every legend, every scripture, every myth started with someone opening their mouth to tell what they had seen. Now it's your turn. You don't have to become a prophet. You just have to be the one who keeps the flame. Because sometimes a single small story told at the right moment can help someone make it through one more day. And who knows, the story you carry inside you might just be the first chapter of a faith that hasn't been named yet.